We are lucky to have here Moshe Bar from the Harvard Medical School. The correct title of the talk is the proactive brain.
Imaginative enough, you'll be able to see connections that I think exist, and many of the principles that I'll be discussing actually extend to beyond vision. So I call it the proactive brain, which is a main principle that my lab has been advocating and promoting in recent years, and visual perception and visual cognition is a case study in a sense. So we study how humans understand the visual world, and I don't have to explain to you why it's so important to understand the visual world so we can interact and we can survive and we can enjoy our lives. And the visual system, like other sensory systems, is extremely efficient in dealing with difficulties. So we can observe things and detect that, recognize them successfully in the presence of noise. Low signal is still good enough for us to understand. And I think that can already challenge your creative thinking and seeing similarities here, how we can fill in missing information and understand what's missing there without really pausing for a second. So we have no problem with this impoverished data, understand a complete picture and move on. Other interesting aspects of the visual system, for example, is that you look at these two objects and you can see this cell phone and you can understand how all this slide is. But our brains, our mind can look at these two objects, and even though they're visually extremely similar, we can see that one of them is a phone and the other one is calculator, and we have no problem distinguishing between their functions, whereas these two objects are profoundly different in terms of their physical properties, but nevertheless we understand that they serve generally the same purpose. So objects in our environment and in our brain represent correspondingly have different types of relationships. Things can look similarly but be different. Things can be different exemplars of the same object. They can be related to each other by context or can be unrelated. And these things are easily understood by our brain. And I think it's fascinating to just stop and think about to what extent we take just minimal amount of information, just a collection of basic pixels, and go from the image up to associations, memories, and emotions. And so this connectivity that is happening very fast and very impressive, and is very far from being realized in artificial systems. And because it's a more social focus here, and I took just random picture from a newspaper, and let's look at these two people here, for example. So again, just collection of pixels, but we can get so much out of it. We can understand maybe what they're doing, right, and where they are. That's not a problem. But just by curvature of their bodies and their body language, even if it's a static image, we can appreciate things about human interaction. And there are some interesting studies about also extracting hierarchy. We can tell who is the boss in a picture of two people very reliably. But again, the focus of my talk and of our research is about predictions, how the brain and how our behavior kind of takes information, takes memory, and reflects it to the future, transfers our knowledge and be able to generate the future based on memories. So of course we're all used to looking at signs and stimuli in our environment and think about the future based on what we know. But I would argue here that even just random objects that you don't think about in these terms are also signs that generate predictions. So if you're in a foreign city and you see something like this, you have no problem understanding, even though you've never seen this collection of pixels, this specific item, you have no problem predicting what's happening inside, and if you go inside, how to prepare, how to dress, what to bring with you, how long to expect to be there. So there's a lot of information that can be gleaned just from a quick presentation of something that's completely novel. We've never seen this specific thing in our lives, but yet we have this very detailed script of what to expect and etc. So one of the main myths, so to speak, when you go to graduate school and study cognitive neuroscience is, even if it's implicit in the way people look at this in the field, by and large, the brain is seen as a reactive organ, this amazing organ that just sits there and waits to be activated by sensory signals, rather than thinking about it more proactively. And it's especially curious that that's how people think about it, because I mean, you can if you need evidence that that's how the field looks at it, you just open any random neuroscience textbook, and you see all these arrows go bottom up. If you think about hierarchy of cortical areas, they look in the visual case, they go from primary visual cortex, from the first cortical area that information reaches from the retina. they go in these unidirectional arrows higher in the hierarchy, higher. That's because I think it's easier for people to think about hierarchies and to think about from the details things build up. But we know from ages or from decades of anatomy that these arrows actually go in both directions. Every area in the brain is connected with another area. The connection between them is reciprocal. It goes from here and it also comes back. And the question is, what is this role what's the role of these massive feedback connections in the brain? And we think that one primary role is the idea of predictions, the idea that top-down plays as dominant a role as bottom-up in cortical processing and in our understanding of our environment. And indeed, if you feed a system, a stimulus like this to any bottom-up system, it's impossible to recognize. Whereas we look at this, we cannot be aided exclusively by our bottom-up system, and we start generating hypotheses and test them against sensory stimuli, against the bottom-up stimuli, and be able to make sense out of this. So, in the realm of visual recognition, the suggestion that we've been bringing to the table here is that instead of looking at the problem of recognition, of recognizing something that's in front of you, and again, it doesn't have to be in the visual domain, it doesn't have to be as basic as recognition, but instead of looking at it as the brain asks, what is this? Kind of analyzing it in a bottom-up manner, every pixel, every corner, every piece of texture or color, ask, what is this like? In the sense that we have these vast memories that are building, that are built through experience, and we rely on it to look at our environment and understand even novel environments by connecting to existing information in our memories. So visual recognition in this case is more like analogical mapping, of finding an analogy between something new and something that's familiar to us. And it facilitates recognition, so it helps us understand what is this rather than, very quickly, rather than analyzing every little detail, but at the same time, with the moment we make this analogy, we are connected, so you kind of gain access to this vast amount of information about this object. So you've never seen it before, but once you connect it to something familiar in memory, now you can benefit from all the connections, all the memories, and all the associations that the brain has stored through experience with this specific object. So it's not only that it helps you recognize, it helps you connect with existing information. So we operate on this very basic framework where a new input is connected with memory via this analogy, and once you connect this analogy, a pipe that you are familiar with in this case, then the brain activates all these associations, all this information that's associated with this new stimulus, and by activating these associations, you can look at it as predictions. So the brain warms up things that are likely to occur or likely to be relevant in a specific context. So in terms of the analogy, we've studied in the past how does the brain look when we recognize objects, and that's maybe different than what you look from pictures that Giorgio has shown, but you know, it's an inflated brain, inflating in the sense that the brain has these convolutions and has this sulci as well as gyri, so we inflate it to expose what happens in the activation also inside, because the whole thing is cortex, it just crumbled into our skull. And the activations that you see here, the colors that you see here, are statistical values of how significant is the difference between your two conditions of interest. And you average it across subjects, and that's the left hemisphere, right hemisphere. These are the temporal lobes, they're just above your ears. That's the frontal lobe. We're looking at in this case from the bottom up. So by now it's an established, or at least well accepted, finding that these areas in the visual cortex are responsive to recognition proper, and they show activation that's proportional to how well we can recognize. So the better you are in recognizing a certain object, the stronger is the fMRI signal in this specific region of interest in the visual cortex. But what caught our attention here, and in many respects started our thinking about top-down processing in recognition, is this prefrontal activation. That you used to think about visual processing as confined to the visual cortex, but here we find this high, executive in a way, or higher in a hierarchy area that's responsive also to recognition. And the question is, what is the role of this area? How is this area participating in recognition proper? And we had different alternatives, but the alternative that I show you here is the one that's proven to be best supported and most exciting for us at least. and that this area actually is the origin of predictions, at least in visual recognition proper. So when you try to recognize something, you perform all these guesses, all these hypotheses, and we think that this is where it might be coming from. And the way that it generates this prediction, we think, is gist-based. It looks at general properties. And again, you can think about metaphors to communication, even between humans, how we can use gist of information to kind of generate predictions and test our expectations based on incoming information. But the idea here is that we can just play a little game here. I'll show these extremely blurred pictures here. And if I ask you to guess what this object is, look, notice how deteriorated is the input here, right? There's just a blob. And I ask you, can you guys guess what this is?
Gun.
Bike
What?
saddle?
Gun.
Gun, okay.
Bike saddle?
What?
A bicycle saddle?
I heard this before, yeah, that's not what I had in mind, but yes.
Brain.
Tornado. Oh. Okay, and this I think everybody knows, right? That's, yeah. So these are the three that we had in mind when we put it, but with different projectors it looks a little more or less blurred. The idea here is that you think about the problem of understanding our environment, and specifically the problem of recognizing objects. And it's a problem of comparing an input with a vast amount of representations of models of objects. We know tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of objects. So taking an input and going one by one and comparing it with every representation in our brain is exhaustive and it's going to be very slow. So this process, by just providing this gist information, already minimizes the process a huge deal. So rather than thinking, going through this library of objects, is this a pen, is this a knife, is this an airplane, is this an elephant, it just limits immediately. This coarse information, this gist information already limits tremendously the amount of candidates that you can consider. So maybe you can add the bicycle seat and the tornado here and a couple of other guesses, but instead of comparing with hundreds of thousands of objects, you just have to compare with 4 or 5. And in some cases, it's even clearer. There's just no other alternatives. Even blurred information, even gist information, is very clear. And in the world of vision, we call this information, this gist information, low spatial frequency. So you can see how in an intact image, an intact image consists of low spatial frequencies, these global properties of the image that are blurred, don't give you much information about details, but gives you information about global properties, orientations, aspect ratio, etc. There are the high spatial frequencies that are more focused, giving you the details and the fine information. But we know in the brain that that they have different time courses. So this type of information is available in the brain earlier than this information. So now we put this together and we think maybe that's how this prefrontal cortex, that the side that we found in the prefrontal cortex, maybe this is how it aids recognition by generating predictions. So in addition to this more hierarchical propagation of analysis along the visual cortex that analyzes feature by feature, maybe we have this quick projection directly to the prefrontal cortex. So bypassing all this systematic pathway, going straight from early visual cortex, or maybe even subcortically, directly to the prefrontal cortex, and based on this blurred information that you just were guessing on, can generate just a limited set of candidates. So these are the candidates you need to consider. Don't worry about all the rest. So if it projects this information to this systematic pathway, then rather than comparing with all the existing representation, it just compares it with this limited set. So you can see how it's a powerful mechanism for making this process much more efficient, just limiting the set of the things that need to be considered based on gist information. And we've ran many studies, and you can find them all online. I'll just describe a couple here and move on to other things I wanted to discuss the next hour or two. So the first, maybe the more interesting one, is that if prefrontal cortex is really, if this area really is originating these predictions, and it happens very early, and it facilitates recognition, it has to start very early. In fact, it has to start earlier than this area here converges to recognition, right? So to do things about temporal questions, you cannot do this with MRI, which has relatively poor temporal resolution. It's good with temporal resolution, with spatial resolution, but not with temporal resolution. So for this, we had to use something called MEG, magnetoencephalography. You don't have to worry about technology too much, other than knowing that it's better coupled with the actual physiological signal, which is unlike MRI. MEG, like EEG, is better coupled with the actual physiological signal. So it really tells you when neurons and in what area are firing, and in that sense can have millisecond temporal resolution and help you ask a very specific question about, but it's hard to see here, but the different present. I kind of opened these two hemispheres that you saw. So again, that's the temporal cortex. So that's the activation that we found before that I showed you with this nice line that is in visual cortex and shows activation that's proportional to recognition success. And that's the temporal, prefrontal cortex area that was active, that we suspect maybe that's the origin of activation of top-down predictions that is streamed back from here in a top-down manner to there. So that's a very clear question, and I wish our other studies were so yes and no kind of, we have one hypothesis. If this is a source of top-down predictions, it has to show activation before this area. So I'm going to show you a quick movie, and then, don't worry about trying to understand the movie too much. I'll show you a snapshot of temporal aspect. This is time from stimulus onset, from the moment we show the stimulus. And again, the question is this active before this active? And the colors are against the statistical values. So you see how activation propagates and as recognition is accomplished. And the answer is indeed that this prefrontal region showed activation earlier, 50 milliseconds, which in cortical timelines, that's a huge advantage, a huge delay. Before it showed the corresponding activation was seen also in cognition. And we employed all kind of other computational techniques to study that they are indeed oscillating together. They are one way in cortical processing or cortical analysis of cortical signals to infer communication between two areas is to see if they speak and they're in the same phase, in the same frequency. So we found it indeed. And we did some causality testing, granular causality and other tools to see that indeed one area influences the other, and it's not an epiphenomenon that they kind of fire together. Other studies that we did to support this, that we conducted to support this model is, for example, to show that this area is sensitive to low spatial frequency more than to high spatial frequency images, and so on. So the model, the framework that we're, to summarize it, the framework that we're discussing here is that, again, early visual processing propagates along this hierarchy, along this ventral visual pathway, but in parallel has this quick bypass projection of GIS information that allows you to generate predictions that facilitate and make this process much faster. Okay, and this actually is an interesting link. This is related to Leonid Perlovsky theory of vague to crisp, where things are kind of becoming more and more fine during recognition. And yes, so in this process, so I talked about this analogy and how we generate prediction very quickly and recognize an object very quickly, but the thing is that we don't see really objects in isolation in our real world. We see scenes, we see complex arrays of objects. And what's interesting about this when you start thinking is that these collections of objects are really far from being random. Things appear together in our environment, they tend to share the same context, and they tend to appear together in the same arrangement. So keychains in England or in the United States or in Italy or in France seem very, very similar. There are differences in details, but by and large, everyone has a sink and a refrigerator and an oven, etc. So the brain takes advantage of these statistical regularities. Things that happen together actually are stored together. And how does the brain use these regularities to generate predictions so that we can anticipate things in new environments that remind us of the old environment? So here, definitely, I'm not going to show any experiment at all, just tell you that we've defined this specific cortical network. That's more the medial surface, so they can imagine a left hemisphere taken out, and we look at it from the inside. So we have this network. The only reason I'm showing it to you now is because I'll show you some interesting overlap afterwards. So kind of have a little mental image of how this network looks. But that's a network that subserves the processing and maybe representation of contextual associations and predictions in the brain. So by thinking about context and associations, very frequently we start thinking about a memory structure that we call context frame. And it's similar to, if people are familiar with the history of AI and cognitive psychology, from the 60s and 70s, people were talking about frames, about scripts and schemas. So the idea is that things that are related to each other and are likely to be relevant in the same context are stored together. We call it context frame. And these context frames they capture these environmental regularities that we learn with experience, and they can be activated rapidly by this GIS information, either by key objects or by global features, but they can be activated quickly. And by activating them quickly, we immediately have some kind of set of expectations of what to expect from our environment. So I showed before, and this is experiment I did a long time ago, and showing how even individual objects can kind of activate context and help you disambiguate. So this object, for example, is completely unclear to people. There are no guesses here from people, but when you place an object that's contextually relevant next to it, suddenly everybody sees glasses here. So this, by using this head that's clearly identifiable and is associated with a certain context, it immediately puts labels on other objects. And the same with spatial relations. These context frames, at least in the case of scenes, also capture spatial regularities. So this head purse doesn't look like anything here, but it looks like a purse here. But if you manipulate the spatial relation, suddenly it stops looking like a purse. That's from the work of Odo Oliva and Antonio Torralba and Philip Shins, that shows that, again, I'm not sure the qualities of projection. You guys see what this is? What do you guess is? And what? Street. Street, exactly. So if you have to guess what this is? Car. So you see how powerful it is. And when you just look at the GIS, this is really, there's no information. Just a blob of blobs. And we can actually say if this is, what is this? And it already can guide our first order of behavior. If you want to cross the road, that's enough for you. If you see it in the periphery, you see it like this because of the spatial resolution in the periphery of our eyes. But we know how to behave. We know how to. So, of course, if you're a car expert and now you have to understand which type of car it is, you need the details. You need the high spatial frequencies. But these low spatial frequencies are very powerful in the sense that they can already give you, the GIS can already give you the ability to label each blob with a certain identity. And that's another demonstration that you look at this object here. I'll save you the guesses here. So people look at this and think that this is a hairdryer, which in this case it is. But if in this case I just took this exact same collection of pixels and put it in a workshop environment, and people think it's more like a drill because you don't expect a hairdryer in this context. So it really helps, it goes in both ways. Certain objects can disambiguate the context, and the context can disambiguate an object. So, and that's another, that's an MEG study. I won't show you a movie here, but it shows these different peaks of early and later peak. And it's tempting, we don't have evidence for this, but it's tempting to think that early peaks of activation here reflects this GIS understanding, GIS level understanding of the context, and only with the arrival of additional details can we identify kind of an individual level these objects. And the ultimate goal of these predictions is to facilitate our interaction with our environment. And we've shown that indeed, when people have to, let's say we compare two different subjects that had to recognize this specific cow. Right? For one subject, it was preceded by a Xerox machine that has no relation, perceptual or contextual, to this. So that's like a baseline. And you see how much faster they are in recognizing the exact same cow just because what you showed them before is a barn that's contextually relevant. So by activating a set of associations, when you see something relevant right after this, the recognition is much faster. So it facilitates your recognition. And so we like to think about association as a basic, and philosophers have said this a long time ago, that our thinking process and our representations in our brain are very associative. All these connections afford a major benefit to our understanding of the world and our interacting with the world. And when I say that the brain is proactive, what I mean is that rather than sitting and waiting there, it kind of connects to things in our environment and uses these associations to generate predictions. So we really say that the brain is continuously generating predictions and therefore continuously activating associations. So if generating predictions is a continuous proactive default operation of the brain and it relies on associative activation, then one needs to show that associative activation is a continuous default process in human thought. Right? So in the field of cognitive neuroscience, that's one of the most recent and most exciting developments of the last decade or two, which has been termed the brain's default network. So if you look at what happens in the brains of people that are not, 5 minutes, are not doing anything, no demanding task, what you see there is a consistent network that's active, that is very consistent across subjects. People activate the same network when they're not engaged in a very specific and very demanding task. So it's called the default network, and it kind of reflects all the stuff that we do when we are not very busy with something else. And you look at this striking overlap between our contextual associations network and this default network. That's another way to portray that the red is the overlap. And for us, it's taken as evidence that associative processing is an integral process of default activity in the proactive brain. And we say that all these associations are triggered by analogy, and all these predictions are triggered by analogy. So just to support what I said before, and it's an informal presentation, but still you look at this thing that you've never seen before, most likely. And especially if you had kids, this thing becomes very clear, and you understand, what's the estimated height of this thing, weight, what do you do with this, what is this part here, the kid put their legs here, this is for food, this is for cups. So you've never seen this before, but you can generate this thing. Or you run into this person in a cocktail party, you never saw this guy before, right? But if I ask you here, who here thinks that this guy is a PC person versus a Mac person? Right? So we already jump to conclusions based on similarities. We connect this collection of features with something that we know in memory, and we jump not only to guess something about his clothing or even immediate behavior. The predictions are very high level. I'll breeze very quickly because put the most relevant stuff at the end. It's your call. Okay, no, but I can do this quickly. So one study was that we studied first impressions, how quickly and based on what features people base their impression of just random faces with a neutral face expression. And we found that they can do this very quickly. But the reason I'm bringing this study here is that initially we had problem with reviewers when we submitted this paper, because they said, oh, in the methods you said these are neutral faces, but they all have expressions when they look at the most threatening people. And by the way, we don't know if these people are really threatening, we don't know these people. But these were judged as the meanest in the collection there. And reviewers kept saying, but they have angry expression. These two faces, for example, are from the Ekman, the most heavily used collections of stimuli. They are faces, and they're defined as neutral by professional actors, etc. So you see these features that remind you of a certain expression, maybe of an angry expression, and you judge this person as threatening, even maybe they look like this when they're asleep, but still you look at their features and they remind you something that can project and connect you to a certain set of predictions. And we show that these impressions are based more on the low spatial frequencies than the high spatial frequencies. We also did another study that compared the effect of contour, the curvature of the contour, on expression, on liking and preference, and specifically we generated pairs of objects that differed in the contour, whether it was sharp angled or smooth. And these are everyday objects, but we just generated these pairs, and also random meaningless objects, but again that they differed in the quality of their contour. And we found that, according to in line with our prediction, people liked the rounded object more than they liked the curved object, the sharp object. And the hypothesis was that this difference in preference stems from a sense of threat conveyed by sharp transition in contours. So maybe somewhere deep in our brain we just don't like these sharp angles because they remind us something, right? Again, it's the idea of analogies and jumping into conclusions. They remind us something. So even if I look at this wristwatch and there's nothing threatening about it, we like it less by and large. There are other things, of course, that affect preference. We like it less. And we indeed found that the sharp objects activate the amygdala, a brain structure that's associated with fear, much more than the smooth objects. So what we did here, usually people to activate this use scary faces, scary dogs, very, very bad, very negative pictures. Here with everyday objects, just because of their contour, we managed to activate the amygdala to a larger extent. So these predictions provide us with some stability. We want to know what to expect. We want to know how, that we're living in a stable world where the next step is to some extent specified in advance, and we can predict it. We know what's expecting us outside of this door. It's not complete anxiety about what it is. And when these surprises or when these predictions are taken away from us, like in the case of extreme surprises, you see that these are faces that some of them are just extremely fearful, and the other ones are just extremely surprised. And it's really hard to compare between them. It's hard to distinguish between them. And just because we're so frightened when our predictions, especially important predictions, are violated. So, no, I'll skip the last part, but basically the last part says that when you live in continuous stage of not being able to predict, it elicits anxiety, and anxiety can result in mood disorder, and we have very nice convergence with mood disorders, and even with depression, and a lack of ability of prediction. So we think that mood is directly linked to how associative or inhibited are our mental processes. So this ability to generate predictions and to activate broad associations actually can affect directly our mood. We show this in this preliminary data. We show direct relationship between a level of depression and mood disorder and associativity, how much you can activate associations. The depressed patients have much less this contextual activation, and that's a study where we actually improve people's mood, healthy individuals' mood, by associative, by guiding their associations in a certain manner. And we think it relates to a level of inhibition from prefrontal cortex to the medial and temporal lobe, but we can talk about it some other time. Okay, so to conclude, perception relies on existing knowledge as much as it does on incoming information. So this interaction of bottom-up and top-down information processes. A rapid first pass, gist, in this case of vision, low spatial frequencies, but you can translate this concept of gist to any level of processing. We use analogies when we answer the question of what is this like, and by answering this question, our proactive brain generates predictions that facilitate
fan of prediction. But I was interested that you are really keen on the idea that you have to have this very fast initial pass. And I wonder to what extent, I mean, in the real world, we live in a dynamic world, so we always have a context. There isn't this big rush to predict what's going to happen. And I wondered what you, because of the nature of the studies and so on, they're all kind of instantaneous situation. I wonder what you thought about this prediction in a dynamic.
It's a good question, and also we arrived at this question also from another direction, which is many of the areas that we show here share the same secret, share the same, or are also activated in emotional studies and studies of fear and other arousal, etc. And I personally believe that this infrastructure is there more for survival, for extreme things. We want to understand if this thing is a snake or not. So we want this rapid response, but once evolution has provided us with this extreme mechanism that can provide meaning, and like you guys recognize the car so quickly based on low spatial frequencies, then we might as well share it with a perceptual system that can reach these conclusions very quickly. And I agree with you that most of our lives are in predictable context, and it's not like I'm blinking and this context changes to a carnival or some other completely different place. It stays the same, and there is some continuity. But there are other domains, like we talked over in a coffee break, where even when you interact with, when you talk with somebody, you continuously try to anticipate what they're going to say next. Where are they going with what they're saying, right? So all these things are split-second decisions that you need to understand, you need to know, so you know better than I do that when people interact, they respond on a much faster scale than, you're right. I mean, there's no rush in recognizing that this is a chair, but when you say something, especially if it's emotionally or some, relevant in some intentional level, I do want to respond and understand and predict as quickly as possible.
Just a curiosity, I would say. When I was hearing you at the beginning of the talk, I thought that one person who would be very happy to hear these things would be James Gibson. But at the same time, I see that the way in which you frame these proactive processes in the brain is more in terms of top-down prediction. My question is, how far is that from the concept of an affordance? Is that a different thing or not? Just a curiosity. How compatible that is.
A major overlap, I think, is that I think both rely on associations. I think if you judge something for affordance, you don't judge it bottom up and analyze every little feature. Say, oh, this picture has a handle, so I can hold it from there, and it affords certain actions. You look at this visual appearance and you connect it with specific functions, with other features that you've seen. So in that sense, I think that that there's similarity. But otherwise, I would predict that the Gibsonian approach is more bottom up, and other than this use of skill. But let me just say before we move to the next slide, just by the fact that you asked in relation to your talk, I think the predictions actually are very important also when you look. I really like your statement about how bad we are actually in communication. People study this and they think, well, we're great creatures, but the large majority of communication seems to fall. And I think prediction actually can play a role also in misleading communication. So when you interact with somebody, you think, oh, this is where he's going. So you kind of, and once we have a clear prediction, we're so used to be good predictors that we rely and we don't let the bottom-up incoming information confuse us. So we stick to our predictions. So you say something, I thought you were going somewhere, and you continue to talk, but I just don't listen anymore. I want to say my thing now because I already think that I know where you are. So I think predictions can be misleading, especially in the context of communication.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you were just saying. There is in naturalistic decision-making, in the naturalistic decision-making field, there's been a lot of discussion about this misleading element in prediction. But what I wanted to say is that what the remarks that you made about vision definitely extend to language. And there were I was thinking some experiments, I think that were done back in the 70s with speech, increasingly degrading spectrographs, sequences of speech for utterances, removing all the segmental information, just leaving the suprasegmental, the intonation contour. And people were subjects were very successful at recognizing.
Yeah. There are other similarities with language where the beginning, Marta Kutas and other people have done this in the past, where the beginning of the sentence is ambiguous. So we said the boy, I mean, anything can come after this in terms of what happens with the boy and what is he doing. But then the more information is gathered along the sentence, the less and less kind of the interpretations you have until it reaches this complete disambiguation. So the more information, the more specificity.
One thing I have two questions, but one is, as you know, formal logic tends to be from deduction and induction, one of which is more or less top-down, the other is more or less bottom-up. Do you know of anybody who is working with the results of these kinds of brain studies with logicians to find a way to integrate abduction? Because abduction was first identified, in the late 19th century, is obviously critical in what you're saying. You're saying there's a constant flow of abduction. And if there were a way to formalize it so that you just had something called abduction, which sometimes was D, sometimes was N, and sometimes was a have, connected in various ways, it might be an advance in the formal representation of these processes.
Right. Yeah, I'm not familiar with anybody who works on this, but it does seem like a good question to follow.
My other question was just in terms of self-referentiality, the extent to which the brain is responding to internal representations as opposed to external evidence and so forth. So on the one hand, it's a source of enormous creativity. On the other hand, it's a source of delusion, solipsism, so on and so forth. Is there a way, technically, to kind of identify degrees of self-referentiality and begin to map it in terms of, at what point it's healthy and at what point it becomes self.
That's another good question, but here, unlike your first question, there's a lot of research on self-referential processes and theory of mind, which is also extremely important in the context of communication, and kind of understanding what's in other people's brain versus, you're not attending and you're more inward. So inward versus outward, and actually there's also connection to mood. In terms of looking out versus looking in. So there are methods and in connection to the default network that I mentioned. There's a lot of research. If you just Google self-reference